3. At 7:30, her cheeks glowing and her high-piled hair gleaming with a suspicion of brilliantine, Evelyn descended the stairs. Mrs. Ahern, a little woman, concealed a slight nervousness under red hair and extreme empire gown, greeted her volubly. Evelyn disliked her on the spot, but the husband she rather approved of. He had keen blue eyes and a natural gift of pleasing people that might have made him socially, had he not so obviously committed the blunder of marrying too early in his career. "I'm glad to know Piper's wife," he said simply. "It looks as though your husband and I are going to see a lot of each other in the future." She bowed, smiled graciously, and turned to greet the other. Milton Piper, Harold's quiet, unassertive younger brother, the two Lowries, Jessie and Tom, Irene, her own unmarried sister, and finally Joe Ambler, a confirmed bachelor, and Irene's perennial beau. Harold led the way into the dinner. "We're having a punch evening," he announced jovially. Evelyn saw that he had already sampled his concoction. "So there won't be any cocktails except the punch. It's my wife's greatest achievement. Mrs. Ahern, she'll give you the recipe, if you want it, but owing to a slight—" he caught his wife's eye and paused, "to a slight imposition, I'm responsible for this batch. Here's how." All through dinner there was punch, and Evelyn, noticing that Ahern and Milton Piper and all the women were shaking their heads negatively at the maid, knew that she had been right about the bowl. It was still half full. She resolved to caution Harold directly afterwards, but when the women left the table, Miss Ahern cornered her, and she found herself talking cities and dressmaking with a polite show of interest. "We've moved around a lot," chattered Miss Ahern, her red hair nodding violently. "Oh yes, we've never stayed so long in a town before, but I do hope we're here for good. I like it here, don't you?" "Well, you see, I've always lived here, so naturally—" "Oh, that's true," said Miss Ahern, and laughed. "Clarence always used to tell me he had to have a wife he could come home with and say, 'Well, tomorrow we're going to Chicago tomorrow to live, and so pack up.' I never expected to live anywhere." She laughed her little laugh again. Evelyn suspected that it was her society laugh. "Your husband is a very able man, I imagine." "Oh, yes," Miss Ahern assured her eagerly. "He's brainy. Clarence is. Ideas and enthusiasm, you know. Finds out what he wants and then goes and gets it." Evelyn nodded. She was wondering if the men were still drinking punch back in the dining room. Miss Ahern's history kept unfolding jerkily, but Evelyn had ceased to listen. The first odor of massed cigars began to drift in. It wasn't a really large house, she reflected. On an evening like this, the library sometimes grew blue with smoke, and next day one had to leave the windows open for hours to air the heavy staleness out of the curtains. Perhaps this partnership might— She began to speculate on a new house. Miss Ahern's voice drifted in on her. "I would really like the recipe if you have it written down somewhere." Then there was a sound of chairs in the dining room, and the men strolled in. Evelyn saw at once that her worst fears were realized. Harold's face was flushed and his words ran together at the end of sentences, while Tom Lowry lurched when he walked, and narrowly missed Irene's lap when he tried to sink onto the couch beside her. He sat there blinking dazedly at the company. Evelyn found herself blinking back at him, but saw no humor in it. Joe Ambler was smiling contentedly and purring on his cigar. Only Ahern and Milton Piper seemed unaffected. "It's a pretty fine town, Ahern," said Ambler. "You'll find that." "I found it so," said Ahern pleasantly. "You'll find it more, Ahern," said Harold, nodding empathetically, if I've anything to do with it." He soared into a eulogy of the city, and Evelyn wondered uncomfortably if it bored everyone as it bored her. Apparently not. They were all listening attentively. Evelyn broke in at the first gap. "Where you've been living, Mr. Ahern?" she asked interestedly. Then she remembered that Mrs. Ahern had told her, but it didn't matter. Harold mustn't talk so much. He was being such an ass when he'd been drinking. But he plopped directly back in. "Tell you, Ahern, first you want to get a house up there on the hill. Get Stern House or Ridgway House. Want to have it so people say, 'There's Ahern House. Solid. You know, that's the effect it gives.'" Evelyn flushed. This didn't sound right at all. Still, Ahern didn't seem to notice anything amiss, only nodded gravely. Have you been looking? But her words trailed off unheard as Harold's voice boomed on. Get a house, that's the start. Then you get to know people. Snobbish town first towards outsider, but not long. After you know, people like you. He indicated Ahern and his wife with a sweeping gesture. All right. Cordial as anything once get by the first bearer. He swallowed and then said barrier, repeated it masterfully. Evelyn looked appealingly at her brother-in-law, but before he could intercede a thick mumble had come crowding out of Tom Lowry, hindered by the dead cigar which he gripped firmly with his teeth. No humma What? Demanded Harold earnestly. Resignedly, and with difficulty, Tom removed the cigar. That is, he removed part of it, then blew the remainder of a what with a what sound across the room, where it landed liquidly and limply in Miss Ahern's lap. Beg pardon, he mumbled, and rose with the vague intention of going after it. Milton's hand on his coat collapsed him in time, and Miss Ahern not ungracefully flounced the tobacco from her skirt to the floor, never once looking at it. I was sayin', continued Tom thickly, 'fore it happened. He waved his hand apologetically towards Miss Ahern. I was sayin' I heard all the truth that country club matter. Milton leaned and whispered something to him. Let me alone, he said petulantly. Know what I'm doing. 'At's what they came for. Evelyn sat there in a panic, trying to make her mouth form words. She saw her sister's sardonic expression, and Miss Ahern's face turning a vivid red. Ahern was looking down at his watch chain, fingering it. I heard who's been keeping y'all out. He's not bit better for you. I can fix the whole damn thing up. Would have before, but I didn't know you. Harold told me you felt bad about the thing. Milton Piper rose suddenly and awkwardly to his feet. In a second, everyone was standing tensely, and Milton was saying something very hurriedly about having to go early, and the Aherns were listening with eager intentness. Then Miss Ahern swallowed and turned with a forced smile towards Jessie. Evelyn saw Tom lurch forward and put his hands on Ahern's shoulder, and suddenly she was listening to a new, anxious voice at her elbow, and turning found Hilda, the second maid. Please, Miss Piper, I think Julie got her hand poisoned. It's all swole up, and her cheeks is hot, and she's moanin' and groanin'. Julie is? Evelyn asked sharply. The party suddenly receded. She turned quickly, sought with her eyes for Miss Ahern, slipped towards her. If you'll excuse me, miss. She had momentarily forgotten the name, but she went right on. My little girl's been taken sick. I'll be down when I can. She turned and ran quickly up the stairs, retaining a confused picture of the rays of cigar smoke and a loud discussion in the center of the room that seemed to be developing into an argument. Switching on the light in the nursery, she found Julie tossing feverishly and giving out odd little cries. She put her hand against the cheeks. They were burning. With an exclamation, she followed the arm down under the covers until she found the hand. Hilda was right. The whole thumb was swollen to the wrist, and in the center was a little inflamed sore. Blood poisoning! Her mind cried in terror. The bandage had come off the cut, and she'd gotten something in it. She'd cut it at 3:00. It was now nearly 11. 8 hours. Blood poisoning couldn't possibly develop so soon. She rushed to the phone. Dr. Martin across the street was out. Dr. Fouque, their family physician, didn't answer. She racked her brains and, in desperation, called her throat specialist and bit her lip furiously while he looked up the number of 2 physicians. During the interminable moment, she thought she heard loud voices downstairs, but she seemed to be in another world now. After 15 minutes, she located a physician who sounded angry and sulky at being called out of bed. She ran back to the nursery and, looking at the hand, found it was somewhat more swollen. Oh, God! She cried, and kneeling beside the bed began smoothing back Julie's hair over and over. With a vague idea of getting some hot water, she rose and started towards the door. But the lace of her dress caught in the bedrail, and she fell forward on her hands and knees. She struggled up and jerked frantically at the lace. The bed moved, and Julie groaned. Then, more quietly, but with sudden fumbling fingers, she found the pleat in front, tore the whole pannier completely off, and rushed from the room. Out in the hall she heard a single loud, insistent voice, but as she reached the head of the stairs it ceased and an outer door banged. The music room came into view. Only Harold and Milton were there, the former leaning against a chair, his face very pale, his collar open, and his mouth moving loosely. "What's the matter?" Milton looked at her anxiously. There was a little trouble. Then Harold saw her, and straightening up, with an effort he began to speak. "Sult my own cousin, my own house, goddamn common nouveau riche, sult my own cousin." Tom had trouble with Ahern, and Harold interfered, said Milton. My Lord Milton, cried Evelyn. "Couldn't you have done something? I tried, Julie's sick," she interrupted. "She's poisoned herself. Get him into bed if you can." Harold looked up. "Julie sick?" Paying no attention, Evelyn brushed by through the dining room, catching sight with a burst of horror of the big punch bowl still on the table, the liquid from melted ice at its bottom. She heard steps on the front stairs. It was Milton helping Harold up, and then a mumble, "Why, Julie, all right?" "Don't let him go into the nursery," she shouted. The hours blurred into a nightmare. The doctor arrived just before midnight, and within half an hour had lanced the wound. He left at 2 after giving her the address of 2 nurses to call up, and promising to return at 6:30. It was blood poisoning. At 4, leaving Hilda by the bedside, she went to her room and slipped with a shudder out of her evening dress, kicked it into a corner. She put on a house dress and returned to the nursery, while Hilda went to make coffee. Not until noon could she bring herself to look into Harold's room, but when she did, it was to find him awake and staring very miserably at the ceiling. He turned bloodshot, hollow eyes upon her. For a minute she hated him, couldn't speak. A husky voice came from the bed. "What time is it?" "Noon. I made a damn fool." "It doesn't matter," she said sharply. "Julie's got blood poisoning. They may," she choked over the words, "they think she'll have to lose her hand." "What?" "She cut herself on that bowl." "Last night?" "Oh, what does it matter?" she cried. "She's got blood poisoning. Can't you hear?" He looked at her bewildered, sat halfway up in bed. "I'll get dressed," he said. Her anger subsided, and a great wave of weariness and pity for him rolled over her. After all, it was his trouble too. "Yes," she answered listlessly. "I suppose you'd better."